14,000 corporate jobs gone from Amazon this year. Not a merger, not a market collapse. The company said it plainly. Leaner structures, enabled by AI. Corporate layoff announcements explicitly attributed to AI reached 21,900 positions in April 2026 alone, the highest single-month figure Goldman Sachs has tracked since it began counting in 2023. The U.S. unemployment rate, as of June 2026, still sits near 4.5%. Payrolls are still growing. On the surface, none of this looks like a crisis, but the surface is where this story ends. Because beneath those aggregate numbers, a structural shift is already in motion. One that is not showing up in the headline data, is not distributed evenly across the workforce, and has already begun concentrating its cost on one specific group. The question is not whether AI is affecting employment. That debate is over. The question now is whether the pattern emerging in 2026, concentrated at the entry point of white-collar work, moving faster than institutions can track, is the beginning of a long reordering or a transition the economy absorbs. What separates those two outcomes is not the technology. It is something slower and much harder to build. Goldman Sachs research, in an April 2026 analysis, found that AI has reduced U.S. monthly payroll growth by roughly 16,000 net jobs over the past year, nudging the unemployment rate up by 0.1 percentage point. That figure confirms a signal exists, and the signal is not noise. Three tensions sit beneath it: how quickly displacement is moving relative to new role creation, who absorbs the transition cost, and what the demand side of the labor market is actually signaling right now. That third tension is where the data gets complicated. The Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, drawing on Lightcast labor market data in its April 2026 AI Index report, found that AI-related skills now appear in 2.5% of all U.S. job postings, up 55% year over year, and up 297% over a decade. That is not a replacement signal. That is an absorption signal. The labor market is not only shedding AI-affected roles, it is simultaneously opening a separate track requiring workers who can direct, govern, and build on top of AI systems. Can the supply of workers capable of entering that track keep pace with the demand signal? One cluster within that data demands closer attention. Mentions of Agentic AI, systems operating with autonomous goal-directed behavior, increased by more than 280% in U.S. job postings from 2024 to 2025, reaching roughly 90,000 postings. Meanwhile, demand for ChatGPT and conversational AI skills fell. The market is not asking for workers who can use a chatbot. It is asking for workers who can deploy autonomous systems and integrate them into enterprise operations. That is a materially different skill set than what the prior wave of AI hiring required. Whether firms can source that capability internally or must build it is a question most organizations have not resolved. That shift in demand composition has not registered fully in the macro data because the two labor markets, the one contracting and the one expanding, are not drawing from the same pool of workers. What fills one does not automatically replenish the other. McKinsey Global Institute, in its November 2025 report, mapped roughly 800 U.S. occupations by their relationship to AI. Occupations requiring AI and machine learning skills increased by 185 between 2023 and 2025. Occupations requiring writing, editing, and research skills fell by approximately 134 to 140. Those skills remain present in the workforce. They are simply declining as an active market signal. The directional pressure is real and measurable. McKinsey also identified that roles with the highest potential for automation by agents or robots account for roughly 40% of total U.S. jobs, concentrated in legal and administrative services, transportation, and food preparation. Automation potential does not translate directly into job elimination. In most cases, it translates into task redistribution. Workers expected to supervise, verify, and guide AI systems rather than perform the underlying function. That is a fundamentally different job architecture than the one currently in place, and it carries a hidden assumption that workers can make the transition. If the institutions responsible for that transition cannot move fast enough, what does the distribution of that cost actually look like? The mechanism that determines whether that transition is manageable or damaging comes down to one variable: the speed of institutional response relative to adoption. The gap between how fast firms are moving and how fast training programs and labor markets can adapt, that is what the next set of numbers describes. And those numbers are moving in opposite directions. The WEF Future of Jobs Report, 2025, drawing on surveys of over 1,000 global employers representing more than 14 million workers, found that 63% of employers globally already cite skill gaps as the primary barrier to transformation, up from 60% in 2023, now the leading constraint in 52 of 55 economies surveyed. That is not a projection. It is a present-tense friction point already slowing the adaptive mechanism economists rely on when they say net job creation will absorb displacement. How wide does that gap need to get before it becomes a structural feature rather than a transitional one? Goldman Sachs research, in its March 2026 analysis, placed the timeline for firm-wide AI adoption at roughly a decade for most companies. In the base case, Goldman projected a 0.6 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate over the transition period. But the same analysis identified a faster scenario: firms implementing before institutions can retrain, with macroeconomic impact becoming materially larger, not because the technology is more disruptive, but because the bridge between old roles and new ones was not built in time. At what pace does a manageable transition become a dislocation? Front-loading is already visible. The McKinsey 2025 State of AI survey found that 88% of organizations are now regularly using AI in at least one business function, up from 78% a year prior. A median of 30% of business function leaders expect AI-related workforce reductions in the year ahead, compared to 17% who reported actual reductions in the past year. Expectations are running ahead of outcomes. When enough executives act on those expectations simultaneously, the labor market does not have time to rebalance before the cost concentrates. The distributional profile of that concentration has a specific shape. Goldman Sachs data from April 2026 shows unemployment among workers aged 20 to 30 in tech-adjacent occupations has risen by almost 3 percentage points since the start of 2025, materially higher than the same cohort in other fields, and materially higher than experienced workers in the same sectors. The wage gap between entry-level and experienced workers has widened. Goldman estimates a 1 standard deviation increase in AI substitution pressure widens that gap by roughly 3.3 percentage points. That is not a diffuse impact. It is concentrated at the entry point of the white-collar labor market, where institutional knowledge is built, where practical judgment develops, where the pathway from novice to senior practitioner runs. If that on-ramp compresses faster than alternatives are constructed, the cost is borne by the cohort least equipped to absorb it. Who bears the cost of a technology transition is a question economic history answers consistently, rarely the firms capturing the productivity gains. There are counterweights to register. The WEF projects 170 million new roles globally by 2030 against 92 million displaced, a net gain of 78 million. Against the 2023 WEF estimate of 44% of core workforce skills disrupted by 2030, the 2025 revision puts that figure at 39%, attributed to expanded upskilling since 2023. That downward revision matters. It suggests the disruption rate responds to institutional investment, that the trajectory is not fixed. Stanford HAI's 2026 data adds a further signal. AI-related skills appeared in 2.5% of U.S. job postings in 2025 versus 1.4% in 2023, a 79% increase over 2 years, set against a decade-long baseline of 297% total growth. The current acceleration is steeper than the long-run average. Historically, the labor market's absorption of new skill demand has tracked the pace of spread, with a lag. Whether that lag is shorter or longer, this cycle is the variable that determines the distributional outcome. The mechanism that converts projections into actual outcomes for displaced workers depends on institutions performing functions. They are not currently performing at scale. WEF data shows 47% of employers plan to move affected employees into different roles internally. McKinsey notes that follow-through is frequently limited. Workers acquire new skills and leave before firms see a return. Goldman Sachs notes in its June 2026 tracker that corporate AI adoption, measured through Census Bureau firm-level data, sits at 19.5% of U.S. establishments, a slight decline from the prior reading. That number matters. Adoption is not uniformly accelerating at the firm level. The labor market is not vanishing under AI. Goldman Sachs research, as of April 2026, finds that jobs where AI augments, rather than replaces human labor, added roughly 9,000 positions per month over the past year. The market is sorting by skill cluster, by age cohort, by the pace at which organizations convert adoption intentions into actual redesign. The sectors absorbing displacement are entry-level, white-collar, and distributed. The sectors leading augmentation require presence and contextual reasoning that AI does not currently replicate. Those two populations are not interchangeable without deliberate effort. And is the institutional infrastructure to make that exchange actually in place? A 4.5% unemployment rate can look stable while the entry-level white-collar market tightens. Payrolls can keep growing while the first rung of the career ladder gets narrower. The headline can hold while the distribution shifts underneath it. That gap, between what aggregate numbers show and what specific cohorts experience, is the labor market story that the top-line data does not yet tell, and it will not appear in the aggregate until the cohort carrying the cost has already carried it for years. That outcome will not be decided by AI. It will be decided by how fast the institutions meant to bridge that gap are actually built. If the bridge is built well, this becomes a difficult but navigable transition. If it is not, headline numbers may stay calm, while an entire generation finds the door into white-collar work substantially harder to open than it was 4 years ago. Whether that generation gets a fair bridge or gets told the net numbers balanced out, that is the question the data cannot answer yet. Facts over fear.